26 meters. That is the current measured height of a stone round tower, standing entirely alone on an uninhabited island in the Shannon Estuary, a structure raised by hand, stone by stone, more than 1,000 years ago, and still standing today with no permanent resident within sight of it in any direction. Scattery Island, off the coast of Kilrush in County Clare, has not had a single full-time resident since 1978. Before that, it held one of the most significant early Christian monastic settlements anywhere on the west coast of Ireland, founded by a saint whose legacy the island still carries in local memory nearly 1,500 years later. Let me walk through the full arc of this island's history, because very few places in Ireland compress quite this much significance and quite this much eventual silence into quite so small a piece of land. Saint Senan founded the monastic settlement on Scattery Island at approximately 534 AD, according to the traditional dating preserved in Irish ecclesiastical history, placing its origins firmly within the early Christian period that produced Ireland's extraordinary concentration of monastic scholarship, manuscript production, and religious settlement across the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. Senan's foundation on Scattery joined a broader pattern of early Irish monasticism that favoured island and coastal locations, specifically for the isolation and contemplative distance they offered from secular settlement, a pattern repeated at other significant island monastic sites around the Irish coast during the same general period. The round tower that survives on the island today, now measured at 26 metres in height, was constructed considerably later than Senan's original 6th century foundation, with round towers as an architectural form generally dated to the 9th through 12th centuries across Ireland. Built primarily as bell towers, though also serving practical functions related to storage and, during periods of Viking raiding along the Irish coast, temporary refuge for monastic communities and their most valuable possessions. Scattery Island's exposed position within the Shannon Estuary made it a genuinely plausible target for exactly that kind of raiding activity, and historical records do document Viking attacks on the island's monastic settlement, consistent with the broader pattern of Norse raids targeting Irish coastal monasteries throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, specifically because these communities often held valuable metalwork, manuscripts, and other portable wealth with minimal capacity for armed defence. The tower's survival across more than 1,000 years through Viking raids, through the broader upheavals of medieval Irish history, and through the long, slow decline of the settlement around it, represents a genuinely remarkable feat of medieval engineering. Dry stone or lime-mortared construction techniques sophisticated enough to produce a structure capable of withstanding a millennium of Atlantic-facing weather, with its basic form still clearly recognisable today. Alongside the tower, the island preserves the ruins of multiple early churches associated with the monastic settlement, evidence of a religious community substantial and long-lasting enough to construct and maintain several distinct ecclesiastical buildings across the centuries of the settlement's active use. Monastic activity on Scattery Island continued, in various forms, across a genuinely extended span of Irish history, with the site maintaining religious significance well beyond the initial early Christian period, into the later medieval centuries when Irish monasticism had evolved considerably from its original ascetic, isolated character into a more institutionally embedded part of the wider medieval Irish Church. Even after formal monastic activity eventually declined, the island retained a resident lay population for centuries afterward, a community that shifted its economic base toward fishing and pilotage work, guiding vessels through the genuinely hazardous, shifting sandbanks and currents of the Shannon Estuary, a skill set that became increasingly valuable as maritime trade through the estuary toward Limerick and other inland ports grew in economic importance across the 18th and 19th centuries. That pilotage-based economy sustained a meaningful resident population on Scattery Island well into the 20th century, a community living in genuine permanent settlement on an island whose earlier religious significance had, by that point, become primarily historical rather than actively lived. The ruined tower and churches functioning as a visible backdrop to daily life rather than the active centre of it. Here is the specific documented endpoint of that long continuous habitation. In 1978, the last permanent residents of Scattery Island, Patty and Austin McMahon, left the island for the mainland, closing out a period of continuous human settlement that had, in one form or another, stretched back roughly 1,500 years to Saint Senan's original monastic foundation. Their departure was driven by the same combination of practical factors that have ended permanent habitation on small, remote islands across the Irish coast throughout the 20th century. The difficulty of accessing medical care, education, and basic services from an island community too small to sustain them independently, combined with a changing maritime economy that no longer required the kind of resident pilotage expertise that had sustained the island's population for generations. Since 1978, Scattery Island has had no permanent residents at all. The Office of Public Works maintains the site's monastic ruins and round tower as a national monument, and seasonal ferry services from Kilrush allow visitors to reach the island during the summer months, walking among ruins that span from the earliest surviving traces of Senan's original foundation through the medieval tower and churches to the more recent, and now themselves abandoned, homes of the island's final generations of resident fishing and pilotage families. Here is what makes standing on Scattery Island today a genuinely distinct experience compared to visiting almost any other historical site in Ireland, and it is worth describing directly rather than simply asserting. The silence is total in a way that few inhabited or actively managed heritage sites ever quite achieve. No traffic, no nearby settlement, nothing beyond wind moving through grass grown up between the foundations of houses that were within living memory of people still alive today. Ordinary family homes rather than historical curiosities. The round tower stands against a sky that changes constantly with the Shannon Estuary's shifting weather. Its stone surface, weathered smooth and pale in places by more than 1,000 years of exposure, offering no explanatory signage at eye level. Simply the structure itself, standing precisely as it has stood since long before anyone currently alive was born. That stillness carries a specific kind of weight that is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Scattery Island did not become abandoned through any single catastrophe, invasion, or crisis. Its history moves through distinct, genuinely different chapters: an early Christian monastic foundation, a target for Viking raiding, a continuously functioning religious site across the medieval centuries, a working pilotage and fishing community into the modern era, and finally, in 1978, a quiet, undramatic departure by its last two remaining residents, closing a chapter of continuous human presence that had, by that point, lasted considerably longer than most nations currently in existence. Standing at the base of that 26-metre tower today, with the estuary moving past on either side and no other human structure in sight beyond the ruins scattered across the same small island, it becomes difficult not to think about time in a genuinely different way than daily life usually allows for. Saint Senan's original community, the Viking raiders who came seeking whatever wealth the monastery held, the medieval monks who built the tower still standing, and Patty and Austin McMahon closing their own front door for the final time in 1978, all occupied exactly this same small patch of land, separated from one another by centuries, and now separated from anyone visiting today by nothing more than the silence that has settled over the island since the last resident left. That is what an island like Scattery ultimately offers that a more actively inhabited historical site cannot. Not simply ruins to look at, but an entire, genuinely continuous arc of human presence, beginning, sustaining itself across a millennium and a half, and then, in 1978, quietly and completely ending, leaving behind a stone tower that shows no particular sign of caring whether anyone ever comes to see it again. If this look at one of Ireland's most completely abandoned islands moved you, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who appreciates genuine, undisturbed history. Let us know in the comments if you have ever made the ferry crossing to Scattery Island yourselves.